I'm delighted to say we're interviewing a man who's focusing on reforming this act. His name is Rob Clarke. He's a Conservative Member of Parliament, and he's a member of the Muskeg Lake Cree First Nation from Saskatchewan. Welcome to the show, Mr. Clarke.
Thanks for having me, Ezra.
Well, I am delighted to have you on the show because you're in a position to actually do something about the Indian Act. As a First Nations member yourself, you've experienced this act. Tell me about your private member's bill to reform this act.
Well, it's 137 years. I remember in the RCMP, when I first saw the act, when I first came out of training, I saw how old it was, and I'm going, oh my God, why are we enforcing such a colonial paternalistic document? And throughout my RCMP career, having to enforce it, I couldn't believe the atrocities that we had to become. One, had to be a truancy officer in the act. And then when I got elected into the House of Commons in 2008, this is where I really started looking at the Act in itself and what can be effectively done for effective change.
Now, this bill was introduced, Bill C-428. That's your bill to reform it. That's a private member's bill, and those bills usually don't get far in Parliament. But this bill has been endorsed by the government, so it's quite likely that it's got a good chance of passing. Am I right?
No, it still has to go through the Senate as well. Right now, it's at the committee stage. When I first started this process, I didn't have the government support, and it had to be an educational outreach and to inform my colleagues just on the Conservative side what I was actually trying to do. One, I was trying to amend the Indian Act to allow First Nations to do their own bylaws. You look at the rural municipalities and the RMs and municipalities, they don't. The First Nations don't have that luxury of being able to form their own bylaws. Everything's paternalistic. Everything in the Indian Act, the government or the minister has to approve. So it's a day-to-day actions of the minister that basically stipulates what First Nations can do.
You know, I wish that this reform was bigger. I would call this a first step, maybe a baby step. I'm not condescending here. It's a miracle that you're even getting this far. I mean, when I read the Indian Act, I was shocked. For example, an Indian cannot sell produce from his own farm or ranch off a reserve without Ottawa's approval. An Indian cannot have his own will and last will and testament sacrosanct. It can be cracked open by politicians. Is that one of the things that that your bill addresses, that last will and testament, something that folks off a reserve take for granted? Is that one of the changes you're going to make?
That's correct. When I first did my first draft of the Indian Act, the title said itself, Repeal the Indian Act. That was back in December 7th, 2012. And subsequently, I've done different drafts to now look at wills in the states to allow First Nations to make their own wills, and also for First Nations to be empowered to utilize, especially in Saskatchewan and Manitoba and Alberta, where there is fertile land, where First Nations can grow their own produce and have that right to sell that produce to the markets outside the First Nations boundaries.
I mean, it's crazy to me. We had this huge national fight about the wheat board, but in effect, Indian farmers and ranchers still have their Indian Act wheat board, fruit and vegetable board. It's archaic. It's condescending. Now, let me ask you this. The baby steps you've taken sound like no-brainers to me. They don't sound ideological. They don't sound left-wing or right-wing. I mean, really, who could be against allowing an individual person or an Indian band to have their own last will? All the rest of Canadians do. What has been the response to your bill by the opposition parties? I'm afraid I know the answer before I even ask it.
Well, the opposition haven't embraced the true idea of my private member's bill. What I'm trying to do is small incremental steps. I've heard from First Nations leaders when I first proposed the idea, is one, you just can't blow up the Indian Act. What are you going to replace it with? And I kept saying to the First Nations leaders out there, what do you suggest? And that's where I got to the current stage of my private member's bill. However, the opposition, the NDP and Liberals, do not agree with this incremental change to allow First Nations or empower First Nations to do their change.
Well, and that's the crazy thing. I mean, if we all say, well, we want to change everything, fine. But until that happy day comes, the fact that they're saying, no, I don't want to make that change, that change, that change, I want to hold out for perfect, that sounds like an excuse for inaction. Now, just before we started taping this segment, you told me that one of the objections was about letting individual Indians have their own last will and testament. And I know I've mentioned this 3 times now, but I just can't believe that anyone, Liberal or NDP or Bloc, could possibly oppose that. But you mentioned to me before we got on camera, that was a ground for opposing your bill. Explain to me the other side's argument there.
Well, that is one of the key components to opposing the bill. They're making a point of saying that Quebec has jurisdiction on First Nations wills and estates. I disagree with that. Myself, I'm also First Nations, but I also served in the RCMP. And when I first joined the RCMP, I had to draft my own will and testament, and I had someone witness it. However, going back to 2006 of July 7th, when I had an unfortunate incident where 2 RCMP members were fatally shot and 1 was wounded, I had to redraft or relook at my will. And that's when I learned that as a First Nations and as an RCMP, I had to get my will approved by the minister to validate it. And that's where I find a lot of difficulty.
That's so crazy. I mean, that's that treating Indians like children. I mean, you're a grown man, you're a responsible member of parliament, you're a former RCMP officer. I mean, you are one of the most responsible people in the country, and yet you would have to submit to some master under some race-based law for approval. I find that so odious. Listen, Mr. Clarke, I'm very proud as a Canadian that you're putting this bill forward. Would you please come back on our show to report on its progress making it through Parliament, including the Senate, where sometimes great bills go to die? Can you keep us posted on how this bill moves forward?
I would gladly come to the program. Currently, right now, we're at the committee stage where we're hearing individuals actually provide testimony on what they would see like drafted in the bill or what their personal experiences are. And I'm reaching out to all those who want to participate in this process.
Well, thank you for doing this, not just for Aboriginal people, but for all Canadians. Great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, folks, coming up, what major